Hey everybody, today I'm going to show you the first real endgame that you need to know. Um, Obviously, the first actual endgame you need to know is the king and queen checkmate. So if you don't know how to do that, you can check that out. I made a video on that. But this is like the first real endgame that like people who play chess mess this endgame up all the time. So you are never gonna mess up this endgame after you watch this video. So how do people mess this up, and how are you not gonna mess this up? All right, a little overview. White is up a pawn, but can they promote? You'll likely never face this exact position in a game, but this position's concept is probably one of the most critical endgame concepts in chess. So in order to promote, we need to guard the e8 square with our king in this position. And black has many different options to make this tricky for us, but white has a simple way of achieving this. All you have to do is get your king to this golden square, which is e6. And I wish somebody had told me this when I was learning this endgame, because I didn't know this for years, but this sixth rank square is the golden square. If you can get your king to that square, it's going to be an easily winning position for you. It doesn't matter how far your pawn is from behind. It doesn't matter where black's king is, as long as they're not, gonna eat your pawn. It doesn't matter whose turn it is. So we're gonna go through some of the moves. Uh, Here, if you play e3 or e4, it's actually a draw because your king cannot get in front of the pawn, and that's how people mess up this endgame as white. So this is a winning position for white, but if you play e3 or e4 or king d1 or king f1, but no one's going to play those moves, it is a draw. So here you have to start with king d2, and really we're just gunning for that e6 square. Black is going to try to stop us, king d7. We're just going to keep approaching king e3. And here black has two options. So no matter how black approaches us, whether he plays king e6 or king d6, we want to grab the opposition. And what's the opposition? The opposition is simply when the kings are facing each other. So the three squares in front of the kings are blocking each other from moving there. That is opposition, and it's one of the most like thematic forms of zugzwang in chess. And zugzwang, that's when your opponent has to make a move, but they don't want to make a move. So opposition is one of the most thematic ways you can zugzwang your opponent in chess endgames, especially if they have very few pieces left or if they only have a king left. So opposition is great. You want to be trying to grab the opposition whenever you can to prevent black from complicating things. Obviously, black could move to this c6 square right here, but then we simply move to king king e4. So just this, for example, this is not a critical line. And if black tries to come back, then we simply grab opposition again. That's it. So if we go back to our position over here where we have opposition, now black has to move, and black has to allow our king to get closer to that e6 square. So it doesn't matter which way black goes, we are going to go the other way. And this is called outflanking the king. It's not really a term you hear much in chess, but that's the term for it. It's called an outflank. And here black actually has two options. So they could try to make things tricky with king d5, or the main option is going to be king e7. So let's look at king d5 first. So we want to get our king to e6, but we also do not want to let black's king approach our pawn. So we can actually play e4 here, and we actually have to play e4 here in order to maintain this winning position. And it's okay to move the pawn here because our king is still in front of the pawn. Okay, as long as our king is in front of the pawn, it's going to be okay. So here we actually have to play e4, and then once you play this e4 move, it's just very simple. After this, you're going to grab the opposition again. Black can't come back here because now the pawn guards that square, and you can simply do this little thing. And once you get your king to e6, that's the golden square. This is going to be a winning position. So that's that line for you. But let's look at the other line where black now moves their king to e7. So this is probably what more players will play. Or I mean, you have to be prepared for both king moves. And here we're simply going to grab the opposition again, because we grab the opposition to move our king from the 4th to the 5th rank. Now we're going to grab the opposition to move our king from the 5th to the 6th rank. So it's basically the same deal. We're going to outflank black's king. They can do the same thing. They can try coming down like this, but here we just play e4, and they're going to have to move back up, and we play e5, and then we get this. We get our king to the e6 square, and it's going to be winning for us. So that's if the king moves to f6. But if the king moves to e8, now we can get our king to this golden square, the e6 square. We have opposition again, and now it's time to start advancing our pawn. So the king moves to d8. Now we can advance our pawn. King moves back to e8. We can play e5. King moves to f8. And now we can do the final step of winning this endgame, which is to guard the promotion square. Now you can make a queen and do the king and queen checkmate, and it's going to be a very easy win. Nothing is going to be able to stop this pawn. So now you know how to win with white. Now I'm going to teach you how to defend with black. So I don't know why I'm in the middle of this study. Let me just change this really quickly. All right. Okay, so defending with black is even easier than winning with white, as long as white blunders. Obviously, this is a winning position for white, so if white plays this king to d2 move, then it's going to be winning for them, or also king to f2, it will also be winning. But if they play the blunder move e4, which a lot of players will, all we have to do, it's a simple 3-step process. First, we want to move our king in front of the pawn. Second, we want to move straight back. And third, we want to grab the opposition. And if we just keep repeating that simple 3-step process, it's going to be a very simple draw. So in this position, first I just want to go over what happens if white plays e3 instead of e4. I don't know why anybody would play this, but just in case, it's the same deal. We just bring our king in, and when the king tries to move in front of the pawn, we grab opposition, and now there's no way that white is going to be able to move in front of the pawn. If they advance the pawn, now the king's behind the pawn, so it's going to be a draw for black. And if they move back with the king, then we can simply do this. Once again, the king is behind the pawn, so it's going to be a draw for black, which is good. So that's what happens if they play e3. But more people who blunder this endgame are going to play e4. So we can just look at this. e4, we're simply going to do the first step of our 3-step process, move our king in front of the pawn, king e7, king e2, king e6, king e3, king e5. Now we're in front of the pawn. So white has to do something. Obviously, he's not going to leave his pawn undefended, so he moves either way. Doesn't really matter which way he moves, because our next step is going to be move straight back. So we're going to play king e6 no matter what. And here, white is likely going to try to make progress, so he's going to advance the king to king f4 to defend his next square for his pawn. And this brings us to step 3 of our 3-step process, which is to grab the opposition. And we know from part 1, opposition is when the kings are facing each other like this and taking away the 3 squares. And that's it. That's just the 3-step process. You just repeat that until it's a draw, and it's pretty simple. So white continues here with e5 check. We want to go back to our 3-step process, move in front of the pawn. Next step in our 3-step process, move straight back. And here I've highlighted a way that black can make it tricky. So we've already looked at what happens, here I've highlighted a way that white can make it tricky. We've already highlighted what happens if white tries to advance with the king. But what happens if they're just chilling, maybe they want to try to confuse black. So let's say they play king d4, for example. We still have our 3-step process, but instead of going from step 2 to step 3, we're kind of going backwards. white is not making progress, so we're going to go back to step 1. So sometimes you move from step 2 to step 3. Sometimes you move from step 2 to step 1. So we're simply going to move in front of the pawn, and now white has to return to e4 to continue defending his pawn. And if white just keeps repeating this, then you're going to get a draw by threefold repetition. So eventually, white has to try to make some progress. We simply go back to our 3-step process, grab the opposition, check, move in front of the pawn, move straight back, grab the opposition, move in front of the pawn, and here white's king either has to give up defense of the pawn and it will be draw by insufficient material, or they can play king e6 and it's going to be a stalemate. So that's it. Now you know how to win this king and pawn versus king endgame as white. You know how to defend properly as black. So make sure you're thinking about this when you get towards the endgame. There's 2 more things I want to go over before I end this video. The first is if you have a knight pawn, so that's on the B or G files, you want to make sure you avoid stalemate. So here white can actually they've got their king on the 6th rank, the golden square, so this is still winning for white. Here white can actually play either king a6 or king c6 and it's still a win for white, but things get really complicated after king c6 because black here can play king a7, and now if you play b6 immediately, it's going to be a draw because king a8 and white can never move the king in front of the pawn because it would be stalemate. And if they move the king behind the pawn, well, now we have the kings behind the pawn, so it's a draw for black. So here white has to play king c7, and now black plays king a8. And like I said, this is still winning for white, but it's complicated because you can't play b6 because that's stalemate. So let's just avoid all of that, and before the starting position, we just play king a6. So if you have a knight pawn, just make sure you move your king towards the corner so that, if black can't play king c8 or king c7 because then the white king moves to a7 and it's an easy win. So black has to go to king a8, and now we just play b6. And our king's going to be behind our pawn in this position, but it's okay because all of these squares are guarded. So the king has to give up defense of the a7 square. Our king moves to a7, guards the queen square, and it's all good. So that's just something to be aware of when you're dealing with knight pawns. And the last thing I want to talk about is this king and rook pawn versus king. So whenever you have a king and rook pawn versus king, if the lone king can ever get to the queening square of the rook pawn, the game is always going to be a draw because the lone king can just shuffle between these 2 squares forever and ever, and there's nothing the side with the extra pawn can do. So if we try to do our normal strategy, black's just shuffling. Black doesn't even need to try to advance the king to make it hard for white. But normally in this position right here, we would want to move our king up and to the left, but we can't do that because there's no more board left. So we have to move our king like this, and there's just nothing white can do here. So white has to try to advance the pawn, and it's going to be a draw by stalemate. So yeah, that's everything you need to know about king and pawn versus king endgames, and hopefully you never mess up this endgame ever again. If you enjoyed, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more daily chess content. I'm dropping videos every single day, so make sure you're subscribed, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.